Buried. That is what the dream is. Not gone, not stolen, buried. Under every reasonable explanation you gave it. You did not kill the dream outright. That would have required a decision, a real one, made with full awareness of the cost. You did something quieter. You let the explanation arrive first. And the explanation sounded so right, so measured, so completely justified that the dream just went under, quietly, without a sound, without you having to feel the weight of the decision because you never had to make one. The reason made it for you. And that is the most dangerous thing the excuse ever did to you. It removed the guilt. It handed you the logic. It made the burial feel like common sense. Feel where you are sitting in this, not in judgment, in recognition. Because this is not a description of weakness. This is a description of a pattern so precise, so consistent, so perfectly constructed that the only honest response to it is to name it exactly for what it is. A wall, built brick by brick with your own hands, with your own words. Every explanation a brick. Every delay wrapped in logic a brick. Every moment you chose the comfortable position over the costly one, another brick placed carefully into a structure that has now grown taller than the thing it was built against. And the wall does not look like sabotage from the inside. From the inside, it looks like patience. It looks like waiting for the right moment. It looks like protecting yourself from a failure you are not yet prepared to absorb. But the wall is not protection. The wall is the failure. And it has been building since the first brick. How many versions of the start have been planned and postponed? How many mornings arrived with the full intention and left with the same explanation that arrived the morning before? How many times has the story changed its surface details and kept the conclusion exactly the same? The conclusion being, not yet. The conclusion being, the conditions are not aligned. The conclusion being, there is a version of this where the starting point is better and the risk is lower and the fear is quieter and the move makes more sense. That version does not exist. It has never existed for anyone who actually moved. Not once, not for a single person worth following. The ones who changed the direction of their lives did not find better conditions. They moved through the same imperfect, unreliable, unguaranteed conditions you are standing in. And the movement itself became the condition. The action rewrote the circumstance, not the other way. Never the other way. The story needs to be examined, not performed, not defended, examined. Because the story you keep telling yourself about why this is too hard is exactly why it keeps being too hard. Not metaphorically, mechanically. The story sets the ceiling. The belief in the difficulty creates the difficulty. And every repetition of the story reinforces the ceiling and makes the distance between the floor you are on and the one you are capable of reaching feel fixed instead of closable. The story is not the description of your limits. The story is your limits. And the author of the story is not the circumstance, not the history, not the people who had advantages that were not extended to you. You wrote it in real time with the exact same capacity that could have written something else. Rewrite it, not with different facts, with a different conclusion drawn from the same facts. The obstacles stay, the background stays, the unfairness that was real stays exactly as real as it ever was, and the conclusion changes from permanent address to temporary condition, from evidence of impossibility to material for construction. Circumstances are real. That lands without argument. The weight was real. The starting point was harder than other starting points. The resources were fewer.
the support was thinner. The gap between where you began and where the people you measure yourself against began is not imagined, it is documented. It is felt every time the comparison arrives uninvited and the distance refuses to soften. And still, using those circumstances as a permanent address is a choice, made in real time, with full awareness of the alternative. Not conscious awareness, not deliberate awareness, but the awareness that is always present in the part of you that knows the difference between moving and explaining the reasons for not moving. That part of you has never been quiet. It has just been losing the argument to the part that found the better logic. And logic is the most dangerous weapon the excuse carries, because logic disarms the instinct to move. Logic says, not yet. Logic says, be reasonable. Logic says, the risk is too high for someone starting where you are starting. And the instinct that knew better lost the argument again, and the brick went up again. The person you are calling lucky right now, stop. Actually feel that one. The persons whose result you see and call fortune, whose position you see and call advantage, whose progress you see and call unfair. 3 years ago, that person dropped an excuse. One, the specific one that had been running longest, the most rehearsed, the most logical, the one that had the strongest case and the most consistent record, and dropped it. Not because the conditions improved, not because the fear cleared, not because someone finally confirmed it was the right time, because the cost of keeping it finally outweighed the comfort it provided. And 3 years of compounded action versus 3 years of compounded explanation is the gap you are feeling. Not luck, not advantage. The decision to stop rehearsing reasons and start rehearsing actions 3 years earlier than the moment you are standing in. That is the full distance between where you are and where the so-called lucky ones are. One decision, made earlier, held longer, applied daily, without guarantee, without confirmation, without the perfect conditions that never arrived for them either.
Time does not negotiate. Time does not care. Time runs at exactly the same rate for the one who is building and the one who is explaining why building is not possible yet. The same hours, the same days, the same unrecoverable, non-refundable, equally distributed resource. And when it runs out the same, for the disciplined and the excuse makers alike, without preference, without extension, without any acknowledgement of how reasonable the reasons were. What does that number feel like when it arrives? Clearly, not as a concept, as a number. The actual count of hours given to the construction of justifications that could have been placed directly into the construction of the thing. Same hours, different output. The difference between a foundation built and an explanation archived. The archive pays nothing. The foundation holds everything built on top of it. And the building never starts until the decision to stop archiving and start building is made. That decision is available at this exact moment, not after the conditions change, not after the fear shrinks to a manageable size. Here, in the exact conditions that prompted the last explanation, the decision is available. What does settling actually cost? Not in feeling, in what does not get built. In the version of the future that was possible and is not present because the start kept getting postponed until the window for that specific version closed permanently. That version does not announce when the window closes. There is no notification, no clear moment when the cost becomes visible.
The cost accumulates silently, the same way the excuses accumulated, one quiet brick at a time, until the wall is so high that the window on the other side of it has been closed long enough that the only evidence it ever existed is the outline it left in what could have been. That is what settling costs. Not comfort, not safety, the future itself. The version of it that was reachable from every starting point the delay created. Gone. Not dramatically, quietly, the same way the dream went under, without a sound, without requiring a decision, without the guilt of having to name what was lost. Because the most dangerous lie is the one that sounds completely reasonable. The lie that says, this is not the right time. The lie that says, you are protecting yourself. The lie that says, the conditions will improve, and the start will be better positioned, and the chance of success will be higher, and the risk will feel more proportional. Reasonable, measured, delivered in a voice that sounds like wisdom and functions like poison. Slow, invisible, fatal to everything you could have been. Not all at once, not dramatically, brick by brick, reason by reason, day by day, until the original version of the dream is so far under the weight of the accumulated logic that the distance to it feels less like a challenge to overcome and more like a fact of geography. This is not what it is. The distance is not geography. The distance is a decision made one day at a time, reversible, not painlessly, not without cost, but reversible. What is the longest-running excuse? Not the most recent, the one with the most history, the one that has been present at every starting point that did not become a start, the one that has had the most practice, the most refinement, the most sophisticated construction. That one. Feel the exact weight of it, because the weight of it is not evidence of its truth. The weight of it is evidence of how long it has been carried. Weight builds with repetition. The excuse got heavier because you repeated it, not because it became more accurate. Repetition is not confirmation. Repetition is reinforcement, and every reinforcement made the next repeat feel more like fact and less like the choice it has always been. Drop it. Not the circumstance it references, the conclusion it draws from the circumstance, the part that says, therefore not yet. Drop only that part. Keep the reality. Keep the full, honest weight of the obstacle, and change the one word the excuse lives on. Yet becomes now. Cannot becomes how. The wall becomes material. The brick becomes foundation. The explanation becomes energy, finally redirected into the actual work. The effort spent building reasons, the real cognitive effort, the actual discipline required to construct a justification sophisticated enough to survive internal cross-examination, to find the logic that holds, to assemble the case that makes the delay feel earned, to maintain the story across every conversation where someone asked how the start was coming. That is significant effort. That is real capacity applied to a real task, and the task paid nothing, built nothing, produced an archive of reasoning that the future will have no use for. Now take that capacity, the same discipline, the same construction ability, the same sophistication that made the excuse convincing enough to work on the most critical audience in the room, yourself. Apply it to the work. Not reduced effort, not a smaller version of the same capacity, the same, fully redirected. And what it produces will not be an explanation of why the thing is impossible. It will be the thing itself. Because the effort you spent crafting reasons could have built the very thing you keep saying cannot be built. The capacity was never the constraint. The direction of the capacity was. There is a version of your future watching this, not with hope, with devastation. The quiet devastation of knowing exactly what each excuse cost, of having lived through the full, compound total, of understanding in complete detail what the accumulated weight of every small surrender eventually adds up to when the accounting is finally done. That version cannot reach back. It cannot correct the record. It can only exist as the sum of every decision made here, which means every decision made here is being felt there. Every excuse is being paid for there. Every hour redirected into the work here is building something that version can finally stand on. And that version does not need perfection. It does not need start free of fear. It does not need circumstances that finally cooperate it. It needs the decision, the one that says the explanation ends here. The construction begins here. Not because the conditions changed, because the cost of waiting for them to change finally became more visible than the cost of moving through them unchanged.
An excuse is a dream choosing to die quietly. Feel the precision of that. Not a murder, not a dramatic end, a quiet choice made by the dream itself, on your behalf. So the guilt of the ending does not have to be carried consciously. The dream volunteers to go under, so you do not have to face what the burial means. So the explanation can function as a temporary delay instead of a permanent ending. So the story stays open enough to never require the closing line that says, "That is not happening." But the quiet death is still a death. The temporary delay that becomes permanent still produces the same result as the decision made directly. The unlived life does not distinguish between the two. It simply exists in the exact shape of what was possible and was not pursued. And one day, the excuses will run out, not because you dropped them by choice, because time ran through them, and the window on the other side of the wall is no longer the size it was when the first brick went up. That day is not fixed. That day is not today, but it moves closer with every explanation that takes the place of action. And it moves further with every hour the work takes the place of the explanation. The life that is waiting is not hiding, not locked, not reserved for someone with a better starting point. Waiting, on the other side of every excuse that has not yet been dropped. Specific excuses, named ones, the ones that have been running longest, the ones that feel the most like facts because they have been repeated like facts for long enough that the difference stopped being visible. Those excuses are not facts, they are choices. And choices are the only thing in the entire equation that remain fully available right here. Not the circumstances, not the history, not the starting point that was handed without consent. The choice about what to do inside those circumstances. The choice about whether the story ends with the obstacle or continues past it. That choice is available. Not comfortably, not safely, not with any guarantee that the movement will produce the result before the cost becomes unbearable, but available, fully, in exactly the conditions that are present, which are the only conditions that will ever be present. Because the perfect conditions are not arriving. The ones worth following never waited for them. The ones worth following moved through the imperfect ones, and the movement changed them. Not the conditions, the decision to move regardless of the conditions. That is what changed everything. Decide.
Not when the fear quiets, not when the support assembles, not when the starting point improves to the level the explanation has been waiting for. Now, in the specific, imperfect conditions that are present, with the specific obstacles that are real, with the specific history that cannot be edited, and with the specific capacity that has been demonstrated by every sophisticated excuse that was constructed with it. That capacity does not belong to the excuse. It never did. The excuse borrowed it, and the debt is due. The work is what it was always supposed to be applied to, not the explanation. The actual thing, the start, the first session in the imperfect conditions, the first hour that produces something other than a reason, the first day that ends with a foundation instead of an archive. That is the day everything else is built from, not the day the conditions finally cooperate, not the day the fear decides to leave first, the day the decision is made that the cost of the explanation has finally exceeded the cost of the movement. The grave of potential is full, not of failures, of reasonable explanations that were never questioned hard enough, of dreams that went under quietly so the guilt of the ending could stay invisible, of starting points that never became starts because the condition for the start was always just slightly beyond whatever was currently present. Do not add to it. Not as a command, as the one recognition that makes the whole picture visible. The grave is full of people who were right about every obstacle they named and wrong about the one thing that mattered, whether the obstacle was the end of the story or the material for what comes next. The obstacle is the material, the circumstance is the condition, the background is the starting point. None of it is the destination, and none of it determines the destination with the same finality as the decision about what to do inside it. That decision is the only variable that the future responds to with full force. Not sympathy, not justification, not the acknowledgement that the starting point was harder. Action, the one language the future has never failed to answer. And the answer is still available from exactly where you are standing, in exactly the conditions that are present, in the same hours that will pass regardless of what fills them. Fill them with the work, not the reason the work is still waiting, the actual work, the start that has no perfect moment, the movement that does not require permission, the decision that makes the future version stop watching with devastation and start standing on something real. That version is still reachable. The window is still open. The wall is still climbable. And the only thing that has ever stood between you and the other side is the next brick you choose not to lay.